Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan, and today we're going to be talking about the eviction crisis in the United States and one key thing that can be done to guard against it. But before we talk about this upcoming wave of evictions, I want to go through some of the basics of eviction proceedings, and particularly one area where they differ from criminal court proceedings. As you probably know, in the United States, if you are charged with a crime, you get an attorney. Any crime you're charged with, doesn't matter what the crime is, doesn't matter if you're employed, unemployed, you are entitled to a lawyer. And this is a guarantee that all of us get. And as you've probably heard multiple times on TV shows, if you can't pay for one, the court will give you one. And when the Supreme Court created this right more than 50 years ago, it reasoned that any person hailed into court who is too poor to hire an attorney cannot be assured a fair trial unless counsel is provided for him. And the idea behind that is that if you are one person who is charged with a crime, who is going up against the full weight of the state, you're going up against their resources, their investigators, their prosecutors, their money, etc. And to have one person who maybe can't even afford an attorney go against all of that is a completely unbalanced playing field. Now, that's the criminal court system. Civil court is very different. When it comes to housing, tenants facing eviction have no nationally recognized right to legal representation. And so unless you have enough money and know how to get your own lawyer, there is a strong likelihood that you'll be facing off against the landlord and their attorneys all by yourself. This is a really high stakes game that could cost you your home that you have almost no chance of winning. A decade-long study of eviction suits in Kansas City, for example, found that of the nearly 77,000 cases that proceeded to a judgment, tenants won 161 of them. That is less than 1/4%. And landlords in those cases had lawyers about 85% of the time, tenants less than 2%. So our guest today, former Massachusetts Representative Joe Kennedy III, is one of several lawmakers who have worked to change this dynamic. Last year, he introduced a resolution to expand the right to counsel to individuals in civil cases that involve basic human needs, things like health, safety, family, shelter, and sustenance. And so here today to talk a little bit more about the movement to get people the legal help they need, I'm so pleased to welcome former Representative Kennedy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My honor. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for diving in on such a critical topic.
Well, what made you decide to introduce this resolution in the first place, and what would enacting it look like?
So when I was a law student, I actually volunteered for a legal aid clinic, and my area of focus was tenants' rights and eviction proceedings, which, as you alluded to a little bit in your introductory comments, they're called summary process. The speed, the whole process there for evictions are meant to be fast, to get essentially people that are in either dangerous conditions or that haven't paid their rent, essentially move this process quickly through the system. If you spent 2 minutes in that courtroom, eviction day in Boston was Thursday. And if you spent 2 minutes in that courtroom, you saw the enormous disparity of power that existed between essentially institutional landlords that were there every week, that knew the process, knew the judges, knew the law, and had been essentially dedicated themselves to the system for their entire professional careers, versus the tenants who, many of whom had never had any contact with the justice system at all. If there was contact, sometimes it wasn't positive. There was a massive distrust between the system, and they had no ability to navigate and get an attorney. And a lot of what was so apparent to me in my time there was, in Massachusetts, there were actually pretty robust rights put into law to protect tenants from getting exploited and taken advantage of in this process. But that only mattered if you knew how to access them. That only mattered if you knew the actual legal code. That only mattered if you knew how to avail yourself of protections for treble damages in consumer protection law. If you didn't, and how could a tenant possibly understand that? It was just as good as if it didn't exist at all. So you saw on a daily basis the massive disparity about what happened if you had a lawyer by your side and if you didn't. And so when I got elected to Congress, I actually founded a caucus to try to increase civil legal aid for our legal services organizations around the country, made it bipartisan, and was able to expand the resources for legal assistance quite dramatically across the country. But we wanted to keep pushing forward to make sure that people understood the disparity of power that exists, particularly in eviction proceedings, but also in other areas of basic need, which is why we introduced that resolution essentially calling for, as advocates call it, a civil Gideon, the Supreme Court case that institutionalized the ability of a defendant, a criminal defendant, to get a lawyer, that be extended to key areas of civil law as well.
So there are a lot of things that stuck out to me about everything that you just said, but two things that I really want to hone in on. The first is, you call it eviction day, and I'm assuming that's something that people call it in the housing court system. And you also talked about how quick the process is. And something that makes me think of as a former public defender is sort of how a lot of court institutions operate in this way that is void of compassion and void of recognizing the humanity of the people who are charged with crimes, or in this case, people who are coming forth at risk of being evicted. And so I'm curious to hear about your experience about sort of the dehumanizing nature of this process and how you think attorneys could help sort of bring humanity to it.
So it's a great frame for this entire issue. So I was, again, a legal aid volunteer. This was 2008, 2009. So it was actually in the height of the foreclosure crisis that we had in the last economic crisis. And what happened was you had essentially a bunch of folks we have these triple deckers in Boston where it's one house and 3 different floors and normally 3 families renting in that home, which meant that when there was one foreclosure, oftentimes 3 families were evicted. Right, so you get 3 for 1 foreclosure, 3 families looking for a place to live. The consequence of this, though, was that you had, as I said, strong legal protections put in place for tenants. Many, obviously not all, but many landlords knew that. And so there was a huge economic incentive for them to get their tenants out before they contacted an attorney. And so they scared them out. They changed the locks. They offered this program called Cash for Keys, where they'd say, hey, you've lost your house. You're going to have to move. Here's $500. Get lost. Without knowing that they actually had strong legal claims to protect themselves and their family from that exploitation, that if they actually had access to a lawyer, those claims could be worth tens of thousands of dollars or months so that they could go find another place to live. In many of these cases, tenants didn't do anything wrong at all. It was a landlord that defaulted on a mortgage. But that system, the extent to which the system was set up to protect tenants, that only mattered if you knew the law and if you had an advocate by your side to do so. And so despite the intentions to protect tenants, it created this incentive to actually railroad them through that system faster unless you provided them access to counsel along the way. And that takeaway has been something that stuck with me ever since, because you realized that it wasn't enough to legislate protections in place if you didn't provide a pathway for individuals that didn't have any contact with the system, for them to be able to access it. And that's what a lawyer can do. I literally saw once in that courtroom a landlord that was represented by a legal counsel take such total advantage of a woman that was there with her kids that the judge looked at it and said, no way. Go outside and talk to an attorney, and rejected the claim because the landlord had so abused his power over that tenant that the judge said, I cannot actually abide by this agreement. Kudos for the judge for doing that at one point, but as you know, the legal standard there's plenty of leeway there for landlords to do that over and over and over again.
And in that situation you're describing, that's probably, this person probably got lucky by having a decent judge. I'm sure it's not common.
It's not common, but again, that legal standard for judges is essentially, within some bounds, even if it favored the landlord a little bit, we'll take it. This one just happened to be so egregious that essentially the lawyer overplayed his hand. But it doesn't mean that if those agreements come down as a 7 out of 10 for landlords 99 times out of 100, they're going to come down 7 out of 10. It's just that lawyer got greedier than he should have. But that still means systemically, tenants are essentially taken advantage of throughout that entire system. And what we tried to do through the process that some of my classmates set up in terms of trying to actually create an entire community campaign to keep people in their homes in the midst of that foreclosure crisis was to ensure that people were availed of their rights, knew of their rights, so that the goal wasn't to slow the whole system down. It was to make sure that the laws that were on the books that would protect you or me, if we were going to get evicted, were going to be there and actually used as intended to protect everybody. And all of a sudden you saw institutional landlords starting to claim, hey, well, this isn't right. Not everybody should have a lawyer. Well, yeah, they should. You do. I'd love to see the guy that owns that real estate company come in and try to navigate this process. You never would. And that's the point.
What a novel concept. People get protection from the laws that are passed to protect them.
Who would have thought, right?
And, and we've seen that cities who are implementing these sorts of programs, like New York City, Philadelphia, Cleveland, San Francisco, programs that provide counsels to represent people, are working. So talk to us a little bit about what you've learned from those programs and how those experiences have shaped your approach on the issue.
So not only are they working in terms of people are able to stay in their homes, again, by availing themselves of the rights that are available to all of us already. Like, that's it. There's no special treatment. There's no special payout. There's no special payoff. It's just an equal application of the law, period. Literally making good on the words that are ingrained in stone or engraved in stone above the doors of the Supreme Court. Equal justice under law. That's all this is. And it means that if you do, people don't get evicted. The consequence of that is a massive savings to society, because it turns out evicting families in the middle of their lives and routines is enormously disruptive, has health consequences, has mental health consequences, and has consequences for all of us that we all have to bear, particularly obviously in a pandemic. One of my former Senate colleagues just said one of the best forms of personal protective equipment is your own house. Why? So you don't have to be in a shelter with kids and a whole bunch of other people that might or might not have been infected with COVID, might or might not have had a vaccine. Let's keep you in your home and keep you safe. Think about the consequences of what happens if you're a single parent and you lose your home because of nothing that you did wrong. And all of a sudden you got to find a new school or find a way to keep your kids at school when you're at a shelter now across town. How all of that is how you're supposed to balance all of that. What it also shows is in New York, under a new program where many people that are facing eviction are provided with attorneys, nearly 90% of them have been able to stay in their home. If that doesn't tell you, based upon the statistics you put earlier up about Kansas City, if that doesn't tell you the disparity in power and the power imbalance in this system between less than a quarter of a percent of cases won by tenants and a small percentage of them that are able to stay in their home versus nearly 90% in New York City, that articulates the difference beautifully.
See the success. Where's the disconnect? Why aren't more cities making this investment?
Great question. I think a couple of things. One, you get pushback from institutional players that have access to power that say, hey, we've got the system. We know how it works. We're used to it. We want to keep the status quo. Well, that status quo accrues to those that have power and exploits folks that don't. So that's one. Two, the misconception that it's going to be absurdly expensive. And yes, well, there's going to be some startup costs associated with hiring more attorneys or making our court system more accessible, and that might cost some money. What that misses is the massive savings that our society is going to gain by not being forced with this disruption. Now, I'll also tell you from having gone through some of these cases, this is actually in the best interest of the landlords too, because I had one case where a woman who had a single mom, 2 kids, had a home. She was evicted because the landlord essentially defaulted on the mortgage, even though she was paying her rent. And she got thrown out when somebody else bought that property, and they said, you got to go. So she moved into another place, got her kids back in school. And about 6 months later, the same thing happened again. Again, not because she did anything wrong, but because we're in the midst of a foreclosure crisis, and the owner of the home once again defaulted on his mortgage. And this time she said, look, I can't move my kids again within a year. I'm staying. The servicer of that property intimidated her, tried to force her out, offered her this cash for keys program, and eventually changed the locks on her doors when she went out grocery shopping. She came back. The fire department had to break down the door to get her in. Her son, it was his junior year. He was a good football player. He had a breakdown that next week at school, and he lost his junior year recruiting. When I got that case and was able to go to court and articulate exactly what happened, articulate the laws to the owner of that property, which was an institutional or financial institution that didn't know what had happened or claimed they didn't know what had happened. The award that came to that family was substantial because of the damage that those actions had on the mom and her kids. This isn't in their interest either. What is in their interest is a level playing field of legal power so that you can get to a right and fair result, not taking advantage of somebody and trying to exploit the fact that 9 times out of 10, more than that, 99 times out of 100, people aren't going to be able to access a lawyer. And that's the current system.
And in the example that you just described, there were some consequences for the landlord for taking these adverse actions. How common is that, especially when people don't have lawyers?
Not, period. And that's why, remember, the reason why this happened, she stayed, was because it had just happened once before and she didn't know about it. And it's not that she stayed because she knew she had rights. It's because she literally couldn't fathom moving again in the same school year with 2 kids, or twice within a year with 2 kids in a public school system. That was why she stayed. But this is not, you literally could not imagine. On another case that I had was 2 families in a home in the Dorchester area of Boston. The landlord was in the midst of some renovations and didn't have the money to finish them. There were literally live wires hanging from the ceilings. There were walls that were stripped down to the studs, nails all over the place. At one point, no heat, no hot water in the middle of winter, rats, roaches, and 3 generations of a grandmother, mom, and child living on one floor, a single mom with 2 little kids who didn't speak English in the bottom floor. The child tested positive for lead paint. Just absolutely systematic discrimination and destruction for these families. And it turns out that the bank that owned that property did not exist because it ended up failing and was owned by the federal government. And this was done while the federal government owned, or part of this was done while the federal government owned the property. The idea that this is how this system operates is just unconscionable. And while not every case is going to be as bad as the 2 that I articulated, the eviction system, Matthew Desmond wrote this, won the Pulitzer Prize for this, for his book Evicted a couple of years ago, articulating the way in which this system systemically preys on the poor. That the reason why people get evicted when they're behind in rent is actually for a nominal amount of rent, and the societal cost that comes with it is enormous. We can do something about it. And that's what we're trying to do. And New York has actually led the way on this, but I would hope other jurisdictions follow their lead.
When you describe a lot of these systemic issues, it makes me think about this argument that I know you've heard before, which is that, in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, that there shouldn't be this unequal playing field where there are people in this wealthy country who don't have access to things like shelter, sustenance, healthcare. They're not guaranteed rights, although they should be. And so the argument is that guaranteeing a right to legal representation when those things are threatened isn't quite the right way to go. It's sort of like just sort of chipping at a bigger problem. So I guess my question to you is, does the right to counsel go far enough? And if not, what should lawmakers be focused on instead?
So look, no, the right to counsel doesn't actually get to the fact that it doesn't absolve the need for reforms to these systems. But I don't think we could ignore the fact that as we look at systemic structures, it doesn't mean we don't fight for equity in the legal system as well, right? And so yes, in a country as wealthy as ours, people shouldn't go without food. People shouldn't have their safety jeopardized. We were talking before we came on camera. I was a former domestic violence prosecutor for a year in one of the courts in Massachusetts, and that is a crime. Domestic violence is a crime of power, and it's a crime of isolation. And to watch a victim make an allegation, to have the police called and have their partner arrested, to have that partner arraigned in court, and then almost immediately have the victim move for a restraining order, protective order, and be subject to telling her story in front of the defendant, in front of a court, oftentimes without any coaching or any awareness of what's going to happen. It has massive consequences legally for her safety, for the pending criminal case, and other cases that might come out of it. And that's oftentimes hours after the incident itself. No one should have to take those risks with regards to their safety. It doesn't mean that as we fight to alleviate or to make sure that that doesn't happen, it doesn't mean that we just ignore the fact that there are measures that we can take within our justice system to alleviate that power disparity. And so, yes, I would love to say we should get to a place where eviction is no longer needed or necessary. Until then, let's still continue to fight forward to make sure that that system at least avails its participants of equal access to our legal protections, because at this point it doesn't. And yes, let's continue that march forward to making sure that for areas of basic need, we do the hard work to restructure our economy to make sure that everybody gets access to them.
So I'm going to pull up a poll right now. Yeah. And it was conducted by Data for Progress in the Lab that talks about the desire for voters to have a fairer process. There it is. Okay. So this poll shows that 64% of voters believe that Congress should pass a measure to fund legal services to prevent evictions, while 68% of voters support a right to counsel in eviction proceedings. So hearing that this is something that voters want, why hasn't Congress done it yet?
So 68 support it, 12 don't know, which means they probably also just aren't as familiar with that issue. So I bet you that the numbers that actually are for it are probably close to 80%. Why hasn't Congress moved on it? One, again, given the challenges that Congress has been focused on over the course of the past year plus, given COVID, I think you've seen them actually come at it in a back end way, but we've seen that eviction moratorium that has been put in place and a lot of federal dollars that have come in for rental assistance, which again is important, and that's a good step. That's not the systemic fix. Part of that systemic fix is making sure that everybody can avail themselves of the rights and protections that are out there for all of us. And I viewed my job as a member of Congress was to be able to educate my colleagues on this issue, make sure that they understood that this was not actually viewed as just an issue on the progressive left, that this was in fact a strong constitutional issue, and you could make a pretty good argument for a conservative argument for a constitutional construction for this reason. And it turns out, Alana, it's one of the reasons why the caucus that I founded, we made sure that it was bipartisan. Susan Brooks, a former public defender and U.S. attorney, was our from Indiana, was the co-chair of it. And she was instrumental in helping make the case to Republicans about why this was important. One of the biggest advocates across the country, if you can believe this, for a right to counsel in civil Gideon is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Texas. Now, Chief Justice Hecht and I don't necessarily agree on a whole lot of things out there, certainly politically, but we agree on this one. And he was a major advocate and a huge supporter of it because, again, just from a very basic constitutional interpretation, the laws are supposed to apply to everybody. Lady Justice in those statutes is blind, and you and I both know that oftentimes she might be peeking underneath the mask, but if the intent is to say that we don't know who you are, we don't know who your station in life, we are going to weigh your case equally, how do you possibly do that when one side has a lawyer and one side doesn't? How? Right? That was what you beautifully articulated about the background to Gideon v. Wainwright and how the Supreme Court enacted this right in criminal cases. If you're in a divorce proceeding and your partner has access to a lawyer and you don't, and you're talking about the dividing of assets or child custody, how is that going to be a fair outcome? If you're there trying to learn it all on your own when somebody's got an advocate that has dedicated his or her life to understanding the system and every trick and turn in it, and is also going to know, in many cases, know the judge and be on a first name basis with him or her off the bench. How are you supposed to possibly navigate it? That's what this is about. And that's not a progressive or conservative issue. That's not a Democrat or Republican issue. That is just an issue of basic fairness and constitutional doctrine underneath the law and in our system.
It's about leveling the playing field. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to delve into this issue. and keep fighting the good fight.
You too. Thanks so much for having me.
So we're facing an eviction crisis in this country where people are being forced out of their homes. And as this is happening, we are asking people who are facing evictions to navigate this complex legal system in the same way that we would ask someone with no medical training to staff an ER. And as this is occurring, so many people in the country who are struggling economically have little to no chance to stay in their homes when they are pitted against landlords who have access to money and power and lawyers. But we've seen that places that fight against this by providing folks with attorneys have been able to give tenants a fighting chance in this system. And by the way, receiving money from the federal government could allow even more places to provide this sort of assistance. And this would be a small step in addressing so many structural inequities that the former representative just told us about that exist in a country where, despite being one of the wealthiest in the world, we do not provide for our most vulnerable. So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been The Appeal Live. You can continue to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'll see you next time.